There comes a moment in life when hiding stops protecting us and starts imprisoning us. When silence, once comfortable, becomes heavy, not because we are ashamed, but because we are tired of living half-truths. I can't hide my wedding anymore isn't about a ceremony, a ring, or a photograph shared with the world. It's about standing at the edge of your own truth and realizing that pretending costs more than being real ever will. For a long time, many of us hide love the way we hide fear, carefully, politely hoping no one asks the wrong question. We tell ourselves we're waiting for the right time, the right approval, the right version of ourselves. But deep down, we know the truth. We're waiting for courage. This is a story about choosing honesty over comfort, about understanding that love doesn't need permission to be real, and that commitment, whether to a person or to your own life, demands visibility. Today, this isn't about announcing something to the world. It's about finally stopping the war within yourself and stepping forward as who you truly are. There is a particular exhaustion that doesn't come from working too much or sleeping too little. It comes from carrying a secret that has grown too large for the space you keep it in. At first, hiding feels practical, necessary even. You tell yourself it's temporary. You convince yourself you're protecting people, protecting peace, protecting timing. But over time, the thing you're hiding doesn't stay small. It grows roots. It spreads into your posture, your voice, the pauses before you answer simple questions. And one day you realize you're not hiding the wedding anymore. You're hiding yourself. Love has a way of demanding presence. It doesn't shout at first. It whispers. It whispers. It asks gently if you're willing to stand beside it in the open. When you ignore that request, love doesn't punish you, but it waits. And the waiting is what changes you. You start measuring words. You start editing joy. You stop sharing parts of your life, not because they are wrong, but because they are real. And reality, when unshared, becomes lonely. People assume secrecy is about fear. Sometimes it is, but more often, it's about hope. Hope that circumstances will align without confrontation. Hope that understanding will arrive without explanation. Hope that time will do the speaking for you, so you wait. You smile in conversations that almost touch the truth. You change subjects. You laugh when someone unknowingly describes the life you're already living. You tell yourself you can carry it a little longer. What no one tells you is that hiding love doesn't keep it safe. It keeps it silent, and silence changes the shape of things. You start to feel like a guest in your own life. Milestones pass quietly. Decisions that should feel shared feel internal. Even happiness feels unfinished, like a sentence you never get to say out loud. The joy is real, but it echoes instead of landing. At some point, the body notices what the mind tries to manage. You feel the tension in your chest when someone asks about your future. You feel it in the way your shoulders tighten when family gatherings approach. You feel it when you look at someone you love and realize they are standing in a shadow you helped create, not because you wanted to hide them, but because you weren't ready to be seen. There's a myth that courage arrives as confidence. That one day you wake up fearless, articulate, prepared for every reaction, but courage usually arrives as discomfort, as a refusal to keep shrinking, as the quiet thought that says, I can't live like this anymore. Not because something terrible will happen if you speak, but because something important is happening to you if you don't. Hiding a wedding isn't just about avoiding judgment to death. It's about postponing adulthood, about staying in a place where choices don't need to be defended, where responsibility can remain abstract, where love doesn't yet demand a public spine, but commitment doesn't live well in abstraction. It wants weight, it wants acknowledgement, it wants a place in the room. You begin to understand that secrecy has a cost. It costs ease, it costs alignment, it costs the simple relief of being known, and the longer you pay that cost, the more you realize it's not sustainable, not because others will find out, but because you are tired of negotiating your own existence. The moment you admit, even to yourself, that you can't hide your wedding anymore, something shifts, not externally, internally. The fear doesn't disappear, but it changes texture. It becomes less sharp, and more honest. It stops asking, "What will they think?" and starts asking, "Who am I becoming if I keep doing this?" You remember that love is not a rebellion. It's not an act of defiance. It's an act of clarity. Choosing to stand by someone publicly isn't about proving anything to anyone else. It's about refusing to fragment your life into acceptable and hidden parts. It's about letting your days line up with your decisions. There's grief in this moment too. Grief for the version of yourself who needed to hide. Grief for the simplicity of secrecy. Grief for the imagined outcome where everyone understood immediately and no one needed time. Letting go of hiding means letting go of control, and control, even when heavy, can feel familiar. You start to see that the world you were afraid of facing is not a single wall. It's a collection of people, each with their own limitations, histories, fears. Some will surprise you, some will disappoint you, some will need time, and some may never fully understand, but none of that changes the truth that you are already living. The hardest part is realizing that by hiding, you were waiting for permission to live a life you had already chosen. And permission, when it comes too late, feels less like a gift and more like a formality. You begin to understand that adulthood is not when everyone agrees with you. It's when you stop requiring agreement to move forward. Standing in truth doesn't mean standing without care. It doesn't mean shouting or forcing or dismissing the feelings of others. It means speaking clearly without apologizing for existing. It means saying, "This is my life," with steadiness instead of defense. It means trusting that honesty, even when uncomfortable, is kinder than prolonged silence. You think about the person you love, about the patience they've shown, about the way they have waited beside you, not pushing, not demanding, but hoping you'd choose visibility, not just for the relationship, but for yourself. You realize that hiding wasn't just protecting you, it was asking them to accept less than they deserved. And that realization carries weight because love that is real doesn't ask to be hidden forever. It asks to be held with both hands, to be introduced, to be named, to be allowed into the future without conditions. There's fear in imagining the conversation, the looks, the questions, the silence afterward, but there's also relief in imagining the moment after all that, the moment where you don't have to remember which version of your life you told to whom, the moment where your story is singular again. You realize that hiding was never about the wedding. The wedding was just a symbol. What you were hiding was your right to choose, your right to stand by that choice, your right to let your life reflect your values instead of your fears. And when you finally say it, even quietly, even imperfectly, you notice something unexpected. The ground doesn't disappear beneath you. The world doesn't end. Some things shift, some things crack, but you are still standing, more upright than before. The truth doesn't demand applause. It just demands space. And once it has that space, it begins to breathe. You begin to breathe. The tension you carried for so long doesn't vanish instantly, but it loosens. Your voice sounds more like your own. Your future feels less divided. You understand then that hiding love was a chapter, not a character flaw, a survival strategy that worked until it didn't. And outgrowing it doesn't make you reckless, it makes you honest. Saying, "I can't hide my wedding anymore," is not a declaration of war against anyone. It's a declaration of peace with yourself. It's choosing to stop living as if your happiness needs justification. It's accepting that maturity is not about avoiding discomfort, but about choosing which discomfort is worth enduring. And in that choice, something solid forms, not loud, not dramatic, just steady. The kind of steadiness that comes from aligning your inner life with your outer one. The kind that doesn't need to convince anyone. The kind that simply stands there, visible, breathing, no longer divided, no longer waiting, no longer waiting, no longer waiting, no longer carrying a secret that has grown heavier than silence could ever hold. Choosing truth over approval is rarely a single decision. It's a slow, uncomfortable process of realizing how much of your life has been shaped by other people's expectations. At first, approval feels like safety, it feels like belonging, it feels like love. You learn early on that being accepted often requires being agreeable, predictable, manageable. So you adapt, you learn which parts of yourself to show and which parts to keep quiet. You don't call it hiding, you call it being considerate, you call it being patient, you call it being patient, you call it being mature. But there comes a time when that version of maturity starts to feel hollow, when doing what's expected no longer feels like wisdom, but avoidance. You notice how often your choices are guided not by what feels right, but by what will cause the least reaction. You begin to sense that your life is being lived with an audience in mind, even when no one is watching. Approval has rules. It rewards compliance, it punishes deviation, and most of the time, it doesn't announce those rules clearly. You absorb them through tone, through silence, through the way certain topics are discouraged and others are praised. Over time, you internalize them so deeply that you mistake them for your own voice. You think you want what's acceptable. You think you're being reasonable. But somewhere beneath that reasoning, something restless waits. Truth doesn't shout, it doesn't rush you. It sits quietly and observes how tired you've become. It watches you explain your life in fragments. It notices how you soften your words before they leave your mouth. It notices how often you rehearse conversations that never happen. And one day, truth asks a simple question that changes everything. How long are you willing to live like this? Choosing truth over approval feels dangerous because approval promises continuity. It promises that relationships will remain intact, that roles will stay clear, that dynamics won't shift. Truth, on the other hand, makes no such promises. It doesn't guarantee understanding. It doesn't ensure smooth conversations. It only guarantees alignment, and alignment can be unsettling when you've built your life around adaptation. You start to see how often approval required you to delay yourself, to wait for the right moment that never fully arrived, to believe that one day circumstances would make your truth easier to accept. But that day keeps moving, and with it, pieces of your life remain on hold. There's a particular ache that comes from knowing who you are, but presenting a version of yourself that feels more digestible. It's not dramatic, it's subtle. It shows up in small compromises that accumulate, in dreams you don't speak aloud, in decisions you frame as temporary but repeat long enough to become permanent. Truth asks for presence, approval asks for performance, and for a long time, performance feels easier. You know the script, you know how to adjust your tone, your timing, your explanations. You know how to minimize yourself just enough to keep things calm. But performing your life creates distance between you and your own experiences. Even joy feels filtered. When you begin to lean toward truth, fear intensifies, not because truth is cruel, but because it removes your ability to predict reactions. You imagine disappointment, you imagine conflict, you imagine becoming the subject of conversations you're not part of, and all of that may happen. But what you don't imagine at first is the relief of no longer negotiating your own existence. Approval teaches you that being loved is conditional. Truth teaches you that being whole is not. And there's a difference between being accepted and being known. Acceptance can be withdrawn. Being known is irreversible. Once you choose truth, you cannot unknow yourself. You cannot return to pretending that parts of your life don't exist. You realize how much energy went into maintaining harmony, how often you absorbed discomfort so others wouldn't have to feel it, how often you confused peace with silence, and slowly you begin to understand that silence isn't neutral. It always serves someone, and too often, it serves everyone except you. Choosing truth doesn't mean dismissing the impact your choices have on others. It means acknowledging that your life is not a group project, that your happiness cannot be crowdsourced, that your happiness cannot be crowdsourced. That consensus is not the same as correctness. You can be compassionate without being compliant. You can be respectful without being invisible. There's guilt in this realization. Guilt for wanting something that disrupts expectations. Guilt for changing the version of you that others relied on. Guilt for prioritizing your own alignment. But guilt is not proof of wrongdoing. It's often proof of growth. It signals that you're stepping out of a familiar role. Truth over approval means accepting that some people will need time to adjust. Some will struggle. Some may resist. And some may never fully reconcile the image they had of you with the reality you present. That doesn't mean you were dishonest before. It means you evolved. And evolution is rarely convenient for observers. You begin to see that approval kept you safe, but small. It kept you included, but restrained. Truth doesn't promise comfort, but it offers solidity, the kind that lets you sleep without replaying conversation nuts, the kind that allows your actions to match your values, the kind that feels steady even when circumstances are uncertain. There's a quiet power in saying this is who I am without attaching an argument to it, without listing reasons, without seeking validation, just stating a fact of your life and allowing it to exist. That power doesn't come from dominance. It comes from coherence. You stop asking how to say it in a way that offends no one. You start asking how to say it in a way that's honest. And honesty, when delivered calmly, doesn't need decoration, doesn't need justification. It only needs courage. You realize that approval often required you to stay emotionally younger than you are, to remain in a position where authority figures, traditions, or expectations dictated the limits of your choices. Truth marks a transition into self-authorship. It's the moment you stop outsourcing permission. That transition is lonely at times because the path of truth isn't always crowded, but it's real. And in that reality, you find a version of yourself that feels grounded rather than reactive. You stop bracing for impact. You start standing. Choosing truth over approval doesn't end relationships automatically, but it changes them. It filters them. Some grow deeper. Some reveal their limits, and some fall away, not because you chose truth, but because they were built on your silence. You begin to understand that being misunderstood is less damaging than being unknown. That disappointment is survivable. That discomfort passes, but living out of alignment slowly erodes your sense of self, and that erosion is harder to repair. Truth doesn't ask you to be fearless. It asks you to be present, to speak even when your voice shakes, to stand even when your voice shakes, to stand even when approval wavers, to trust that your life lived honestly has a right to take up space. And in choosing truth, you don't become harder. You become clearer. You don't lose empathy. You gain boundaries. You don't reject others. You stop rejecting yourself. Approval may feel like love, but truth feels like home. Stepping into adulthood through honesty, not rebellion, is not a sudden realization. It is a series of small awakenings, subtle but undeniable, that tell you the life you have been performing for others is no longer sufficient for yourself. You realize that maturity is often mistaken for conformity, and that many of the rules you followed were not markers of wisdom, but of expectation. You adapted, you complied, you waited, hoping that someday someone else's approval would coincide with your own desires. But the more you wait, the more distant that alignment feels. And the more you understand that adulthood is not granted by others, it is claimed through action, through conscious choice, through the willingness to show up fully as yourself. Honesty is the foundation of this transition, not the loud honesty that seeks confrontation, but the quiet, unwavering honesty that begins in the private spaces of thought and reflection. It's the honesty that acknowledges what has been concealed, the feelings that have been softened for comfort, and the decisions that have been deferred to accommodate others. Do you notice how often your life has been negotiated quietly in your own mind, and how much of that negotiation has kept you small? Adulthood, you come to see, is not a title, an age, or a role assigned. It is the state of being aligned with your own truths, even when doing so makes others uncomfortable. This path is rarely free of fear. Fear of judgment, fear of disappointment, fear of losing the familiarity of routines that were once considered safety. But you also recognize that rebellion, the kind that is loud, defiant, or performative, is not necessarily the antidote. Rebellion can be an escape from responsibility, a protest without construction. Honesty, by contrast, carries weight. It is deliberate, it is rooted, it is rooted, it is courageous precisely because it refuses to be an act. You are not rebelling against the world. You are stepping toward your own life with integrity. The process of stepping into adulthood this way is iterative. You make small choices every day that align with your values instead of with expectation. You choose to speak truths that you might once have softened. You choose to share parts of your life previously hidden. You choose boundaries that feel unnatural at first, but eventually solidify into clarity. These choices are often met with surprise, sometimes with resistance. Some people may struggle to recognize the person you are becoming because they knew only the version that was quiet, compliant, and pliable, and that's acceptable. Adulthood is not about everyone's comprehension. It is about your own coherence. You come to see the difference between compliance and participation. Compliance is the act of doing what is asked or expected. Participation is the act of engaging fully, responsibly, and honestly. True adulthood requires participation, not performance. You cannot live authentically if you are constantly measuring the reactions of others before taking action. You begin to recognize the subtle ways in which your life was curated for palatability and the relief that comes when you stop curating for anyone other than yourself. There is a learning curve in honesty. It is rarely clean. There are missteps, awkward moments, and times when your intentions are misunderstood. But these moments do not indicate failure. They indicate growth. Every time you speak honestly, every time you act in accordance with your values rather than expectation, you reinforce the foundation upon which your adult life is built. You are learning to carry responsibility not as a burden, but as a structure that supports freedom. You start noticing patterns that were once invisible, the subtle compromises, the quiet apologies, the ways in which fear shaped decisions more than desire. You see that in hiding or softening your truth. You were not protecting others, but often protecting yourself from confrontation with your own life. And the paradox becomes clear. Adulthood through honesty is not about conflict, but about alignment. The closer your life aligns with your truth, the less inner conflict you experience. Fear does not vanish, but it loses its grip. Responsibility is inseparable from honesty. To live honestly is to recognize the impact of your actions on yourself and others. But responsibility does not mean controlling every reaction, appeasing every expectation, or negotiating your values to preserve comfort. Responsibility means owning your choices, including the discomfort they may cause, and understanding that the alternative, continuing to hide, perform, or comply, carries a different, more subtle form of harm. It erodes confidence, fosters resentment, and perpetuates fragmentation of self. There is an elegance and simplicity that emerges from this approach. Decisions become less about calculation and more about clarity. Conversations previously rehearsed endlessly gain a natural rhythm. Relationships previously managed cautiously develop depth and authenticity. You find that people respond not to rebellion, not to dramatics, but to consistency, honesty, and the quiet courage of someone fully present in their own life. You stop needing approval, not out of defiance, but because alignment with your own truth is sufficient. Adulthood also means accepting that some people will not understand and that their lack of understanding is not a reflection of your truth. The world does not bend entirely to accommodate each individual's awakening. Some friends may struggle, some family members may resist, and some dynamics may change irreversibly. But you discover that the cost of remaining hidden is far greater than the discomfort of being seen. A secret you carry does not protect anyone. It constrains everyone, most of all yourself. Honesty reshapes time. Decisions are no longer delayed indefinitely for approval or perceived convenience. You learn to act in accordance with your values without postponement. You realize that waiting for ideal conditions often means waiting for permission that will never come. Therefore, Stepping into adulthood is also stepping into agency, the conscious choice to live deliberately rather than reactively, to move forward with intention rather than hesitation, and to allow life to unfold in the fullness of your participation. This path nurtures resilience. You encounter moments of doubt, but you also encounter moments of clarity that reaffirm your choices. The weight of silence lifts, the tension of concealment dissipates. Your presence in your own life becomes palpable, undeniable, and steady. You recognize that adulthood is not about eliminating fear or discomfort, but about acting despite them. It is about standing in your own reality and allowing that reality to shape your existence. Through honesty, you gain perspective. You see that the life you've been hiding from is not perfect, but it is real. And reality has its own dignity. It does not require embellishment, defense, or justification. You begin to notice the beauty in ordinariness, the grace in simple truth, and the power in the unadorned act of being. Fully present, the adult you are becoming does not seek applause, but you notice that respect and understanding often follow naturally, unforced, and quietly. You understand that this journey is ongoing. Adulthood through honesty is not a destination, it is a way of moving through life. Each decision, each interaction, each revelation becomes a practice. You refine your boundaries, you articulate your intentions, and you measure growth not by external metrics, but by internal coherence. And in doing so, you learn that integrity, living in accordance with your own truths, is the truest marker of maturity. Stepping into adulthood this way transforms relationships. Interactions deepen because they are grounded in reality. Misunderstandings still occur, but they are addressed from a place of clarity rather than pretense. Trust is earned through transparency rather than management. You stop seeking validation externally because validation internally, through honesty, alignment, and consistent presence, becomes sufficient. And in that sufficiency, freedom emerges. Not chaotic freedom, but the freedom that comes from standing unfragmented, fully accountable, fully visible, and fully alive. You begin to recognize that the courage to be honest is also a gift to others. It frees them from guessing, from managing your reactions, from projecting expectations. It invites them to respond to the real you rather than a curated version. And while not everyone will embrace this honesty, the relationships that survive it, the bonds that deepen, are no longer conditional or performative. They are real, durable, and mutually respectful. Adulthood through honesty is an act of courage that is invisible to many, misunderstood by some, and deeply transformative for the self. It teaches patience, responsibility, and resilience. It shapes character not through rebellion or defiance, but through deliberate alignment, conscious action, and the quiet acknowledgement that your life belongs to you first. It reshapes your inner world, giving clarity, coherence, and a sense of grounding that cannot be borrowed or simulated. You realize that rebellion is often reactive, rooted in opposition. Honesty, in contrast, is proactive, rooted in alignment. It does not seek to provoke, but to settle. It does not demand spectacle, but presence. And in presence, you find the essence of adulthood, a life lived consciously, responsibly, and in harmony with the person you are, rather than the person you are expected to be. Stepping into adulthood through honesty, not rebellion, reshapes how you see yourself, how you move through the world, and how you relate to others. It is not easy. It is not instantaneous. It is not always understood, but it is steady, enduring, and profoundly liberating. The choices you make are your own. The consequences, the learning, and the growth belong to you. And in that ownership, you begin to experience life in its fullness, depth, and clarity.